Part 1. They called me the Serpent, not for any particular physical attribute, though I suppose my movements were, at times, serpentine. No, the name came from my ability to slither into places unseen, unnoticed. To blend, to become part of the background, a shadow clinging to the periphery. I was the perfect instrument, honed over decades, polished to a lethal edge. And I was tasked with eliminating His Holiness, Pope Clement XIV. The year was 1774. Rome buzzed with whispers and intrigue. The air, thick with the scent of incense and decay, seemed to vibrate with anticipation. The Jesuits, once the Pope's most powerful allies, had fallen from grace. Suppressed, their influence dismantled, they were a wounded beast, lashing out in the shadows. And I, a product of their meticulous training, was the chosen weapon, the venomous strike meant to restore their power. My preparations were meticulous, a tapestry woven with intricate detail. I studied the Pope's routines, the layout of the Vatican, the shifts in the Swiss Guard. I memorized the creaks in the floorboards, the rhythm of the bells, the precise moment when the shadows stretched longest across the papal apartments. Every breath, every heartbeat was calculated, a piece of a larger deadly equation. I infiltrated the Vatican disguised as a humble scribe, tasked with cataloging ancient texts. Days bled into weeks as I built my cover, meticulously crafting a persona of quiet diligence. I ate with the other scribes, slept in their Spartan quarters, listened to their petty grievances. I became one of them, a ghost in the machine, invisible in plain sight. The weight of my mission pressed upon me, a constant, suffocating presence. Sleep offered no escape, only fragmented visions of the Pope's lifeless eyes staring into the abyss. I dreamt of the serpent, its scales shimmering in the moonlight, its fangs dripping with venom. I was both the hunter and the hunted, trapped in a cycle of violence I could not escape. The Vatican, a fortress of faith, was also a labyrinth of secrets. Whispers echoed in the marble corridors, hinting at conspiracies and betrayals. Cardinals plotted against each other, vying for power. Nuns, their faces veiled in piety, engaged in clandestine affairs. Guards, sworn to protect the Holy See, accepted bribes with eager hands. I moved through this world of shadows, observing, absorbing, becoming a part of the corruption I was meant to eradicate. The closer I got to my target, the more I questioned my purpose. The Pope, a frail old man with kind eyes and a gentle smile, seemed an unlikely enemy. He spoke of peace and forgiveness, virtues that felt alien to the world I inhabited. Was I truly an instrument of justice, or merely a pawn in a larger game? Doubt gnawed at my resolve, a persistent ache in my soul. The training, the years of conditioning, began to unravel. I saw myself not as a righteous avenger, but as a cold-blooded killer. The serpent, once a symbol of power, now felt like a curse. I spent hours in the Vatican library, surrounded by the wisdom of the ages, searching for answers that eluded me. I read the words of saints and philosophers, of poets and heretics. I sought solace in their wisdom, but found only more questions. What was the true nature of good and evil? Was there a path to redemption for a soul stained with blood? The day of the assassination approached, a looming shadow casting a pall over my existence. The serpent coiled within me, ready to strike. But something else stirred within me as well, a flicker of something I hadn't felt in years. Hope, not hope for myself, but for a world beyond the shadows. A world where the serpent could shed its skin and be reborn. And as I prepared to carry out my mission, a chilling discovery unfolded before me, something far more terrifying than the act of killing a pope. Something that would shatter my world and force me to confront the true darkness that lurked not in the Vatican's corridors, but within the human heart itself. The chanting continued, a low, rhythmic thrumming that vibrated through the stone floor and up into my bones. I pressed myself further into the shadows, the rough texture of the Vatican's ancient walls scraping against my back. The Swiss Guard patrolled with their halberds, oblivious to the creeping dread that permeated the air, oblivious to the unnatural hum that seemed to emanate from the very earth beneath us. They were guarding against flesh and blood, not against this. My mission was simple: eliminate the Pope, a straightforward assassination, in and out. But the Vatican, I found, wasn't the one depicted in the briefing files. It was infected. This wasn't a holy sanctuary. It was a mausoleum masquerading as one. I adjusted the suppressor on my pistol. The metallic click strangely loud in the suffocating silence between the chants. The rhythmic pulse continued, growing subtly stronger, intertwining with the echoing hymns of the unseen choir. The hymns themselves were off, distorted, like a warped record played at the wrong speed. The Latin words were slurred, elongated, as if sung by beings whose mouths were no longer quite human. My target should have been in the papal apartments, preparing for his evening address. But the apartments were empty, devoid of life, save for a lingering, cloying sweetness in the air, an aroma like overripe fruit, and something else. Something metallic, like blood. I had checked the Sistine Chapel, drawn by the chanting. It was empty, too, though the air shimmered with an unnatural heat. The frescoes, Michelangelo's masterpiece, seemed to writhe in the flickering candlelight. The figures elongated, their eyes following me as I moved. Their expressions weren't those of divine beings, but of something hungry. Now, I found myself in a network of tunnels beneath the basilica, guided by the escalating chanting. These weren't on any blueprints I'd studied. They were older, more organic. The walls weren't smooth-hewn stone, but seemed to be formed of fused bone and something resembling hardened sinew. A thin, viscous fluid seeped from the walls, coating the floor in a slick, iridescent sheen. The smell here was overwhelming. The sweetness from the papal apartments was amplified 100-fold, mixed with the stench of decay and the metallic tang of blood. I gagged, clamping a hand over my mouth, my stomach churning. This wasn't just death, it was perversion, a mockery of life itself. The chanting grew louder, punctuated by a rhythmic, wet slapping sound. My heart hammered against my ribs. I crept forward, my hand brushing against the wall, the texture sickeningly soft and yielding. The tunnel opened into a vast cavern. The air here was thick with the cloying sweetness. The stench of decay almost unbearable. Hundreds of candles flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls, illuminating a scene that sent a wave of nausea crashing over me. In the center of the cavern, a group of figures robed in crimson chanted in unison. Their robes were stained with the same iridescent fluid that coated the tunnel walls. Their faces were obscured by deep cowls, but I could see glimpses of pale, glistening skin beneath. They moved with a disturbing fluidity, their limbs bending at unnatural angles. Before them, on a makeshift altar fashioned from human bones, lay the Pope. He was naked, his frail body glistening with the same viscous fluid. He wasn't dead, not yet. His chest rose and fell with shallow, ragged breaths. His eyes were wide, unseeing, staring up at the cavern roof. The rhythmic slapping sound I'd heard in the tunnel came from the robed figures. They were consuming him, not with teeth, but with their hands. They pressed their palms against his flesh, and with each press, a portion of him seemed to dissolve, absorbed into their skin. The fluid on his body pulsed and shimmered, flowing from him into them. I watched, frozen in horror, as the Pope's body slowly diminished, his life force draining away into the robed figures. The chanting intensified, reaching a fever pitch. The figures swayed and writhed, their movements growing more frenzied, more inhuman. Then, one of the figures turned, its cowl falling back to reveal a face that was no longer human. The skin was stretched taut over elongated bones, the eyes huge and black, devoid of pupils. Its mouth was a gaping maw filled with needle-sharp teeth, and from it issued a low, guttural growl. It looked directly at me. The chanting stopped. The other figures turned, their cowls falling back to reveal identical, monstrous visages. They stared at me, their black eyes burning with a hunger that chilled me to the bone. My mission was to kill the Pope, but the Pope was already something else, and now they knew I was here. My mission had changed. Survival was now the only objective, and I had a terrible feeling that escaping this unholy place would be far more difficult than getting in. The chanting grew louder, a guttural, rhythmic pulse that vibrated in my bones. I pressed myself flatter against the cold stone, the rough texture scraping my skin. Below, the procession continued, a macabre ballet of shadow and flickering candlelight. The Pope, or whatever remained of him, was now fully visible. His movements were stiff, jerky, almost mechanical. His head, however, lolled at an unnatural angle, occasionally lolling forward, as if struggling against some unseen force. Naori. I felt a creeping dread unlike anything I'd ever experienced. This wasn't the fear of being caught, the adrenaline-fueled tension of the hunt. This was something primordial, a fear that resonated deep within my DNA, whispering of ancient, forgotten horrors. The procession reached the altar, a towering structure of obsidian that seemed to absorb the candlelight, casting long, distorted shadows across the chamber. The chanting reached a fever pitch, and the robed figures surrounding the Pope began to sway rhythmically, their movements becoming increasingly frenzied. Then, the chanting stopped. An oppressive silence descended, broken only by the ragged breaths escaping my own lungs. The Pope, or the thing wearing his skin, was positioned before the altar. The tallest of the robed figures, presumably the cardinal I'd seen earlier, stepped forward. He raised his hands, and the other figures mirrored the gesture. The silence stretched, thin and brittle, pregnant with a terrible anticipation. Slowly, deliberately, the cardinal reached into the folds of his robe. He withdrew a long, slender knife, its blade gleaming obscenely in the candlelight. My hand instinctively went to my own weapon, a specially designed silenced pistol tucked beneath my jacket. I knew I should act, escape, while I had the chance. But something held me back, a morbid fascination, a need to see what would happen next. The cardinal raised the knife above his head, the tip pointed towards the vaulted ceiling. The Pope's head snapped back, as if pulled by invisible strings, and a low, guttural groan emanated from its throat. It wasn't a human sound. It was something deeper, something ancient, something wrong. Then, the cardinal brought the knife down, not towards the Pope, but towards his own chest. He drove the blade deep, a sickening thud echoing through the chamber. The other robed figures followed suit, each plunging their own knives into their chests with chilling synchronicity. The air filled with a coppery tang of blood. I fought the urge to vomit, the bile rising in my throat. The Pope, still standing, began to tremble violently. The head lolled forward again, and this time it didn't rise. A low, wet chuckle escaped its lips, a sound that sent shivers down my spine. It was a sound devoid of mirth, a sound of pure, unadulterated malice. The robed figures, now lifeless, crumpled to the floor, forming a grotesque circle around the altar. The Pope, still chuckling, began to sway, its movements becoming increasingly erratic. Then, it stopped. It stood perfectly still, the head hanging limply. The silence returned, heavier, more oppressive than before. Minutes ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity. I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe. The scene before me was a tableau of unimaginable horror, a nightmare rendered in flesh and blood. Suddenly, the Pope's head snapped up. Its eyes, which had been closed, were now wide open, staring directly at me. Even from my vantage point, high above, I could see them. They weren't human eyes. They were black, bottomless pits, radiating an ancient, malevolent intelligence. The chuckle returned, louder this time, echoing through the chamber like the mocking laughter of a demon. The Pope took a step forward, then another. It began to walk towards the altar steps, its movements no longer stiff and jerky, but fluid, almost predatory. I knew I had to leave. This wasn't a mission anymore. This was survival. I began to inch backwards, slowly, carefully, trying not to make a sound. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the oppressive silence. I reached the edge of the platform, my hands searching for the rope I had used to climb up. My fingers brushed against it, a small but significant victory. Then, the chanting started again. It wasn't coming from the chamber below. It was coming from behind me. I froze, my blood turning to ice in my veins. Slowly, I turned my head. Standing there, in the darkness, were more robed figures. Dozens of them, their faces obscured by shadows, their voices joining in the guttural chant. They were surrounding me. And in the center, standing just a few feet away, was the cardinal. He was smiling, a wide, unsettling grin that stretched his lips thin and revealed rows of pointed yellow teeth. His chest, where he had plunged the knife, was unmarked. There was no blood, no wound, just smooth, pale skin. He raised a hand, and the chanting stopped. He took a step closer, his eyes, like the Pope's, black and bottomless. "You have seen too much," he whispered, his voice a dry, rasping sound. "Now you must join us." I reached for my pistol, my fingers trembling. But it was too late. The robed figures surged forward, their hands outstretched, their voices rising in a crescendo of unholy sound. I was trapped. The chanting continued, a low, guttural drone that seemed to vibrate the very stone beneath my feet. I crept closer to the hidden chamber's entrance, the cold seeping through my gloves. The crimson stain on the floor, where the Swiss guard had fallen, was now a dark, almost black patch. It pulsed faintly, like a morbid heartbeat. I could smell something now, something beyond the dust and age. A metallic tang, acrid and cloying, like blood left to congeal in the sun. I pressed my ear against the cold stone. The chanting intensified, interspersed with whispers, too low for me to decipher. I pulled back, my heart hammering against my ribs. This wasn't the Vatican I knew. This was something else, something ancient and unholy. My mission, the Pope, seemed almost trivial now, a distraction from the true horror unfolding beneath St. Peter's Basilica. I took a slow, deep breath, pulled out my lockpick, and went to work on the ancient mechanism. The lock was intricate, more complex than I'd anticipated, each tumbler a tiny puzzle. But my hands, despite the tremor of fear that ran through me, were steady. Years of training, of honing my skills in the shadows, had prepared me for this. Finally, with a soft click, the lock yielded. The heavy stone door creaked open, revealing a narrow, descending staircase. The chanting was louder now, echoing up from the darkness below, punctuated by a rhythmic thumping, like a giant heart. The metallic smell was stronger, almost overpowering. I hesitated. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to run, to pretend I'd seen nothing. But something, a morbid curiosity, a perverse sense of duty, compelled me forward. I pulled out my flashlight, its beam cutting through the inky blackness. The staircase was steep and narrow, the stone worn smooth by centuries of use. The air grew colder with each descending step, the chanting growing louder, more insistent. The rhythmic thumping echoed in my chest, a counterpoint to the frantic beating of my own heart. After what felt like an eternity, the staircase opened into a large, circular chamber. The air was thick with the metallic stench, and the chanting reached a crescendo. My flashlight beam danced across the scene, revealing a sight that made my blood run cold. The chamber was vast, the walls lined with shelves filled with jars, hundreds of them. Each jar contained a something. A grotesque parody of a human heart, pulsating rhythmically, connected by a network of thin, glistening tubes that snaked across the floor and walls, converging on a central altar. And on that altar, the Pope. He was naked, his frail body strapped to the altar, his chest cavity open, but his heart was still beating, pulsing weakly, connected to the network of tubes. Around him, a dozen figures in dark robes chanted, their faces hidden by deep hoods. They moved rhythmically, their hands making strange gestures over the Pope's exposed chest. The rhythmic thumping I'd heard was the combined pulsating of the hundreds of hearts in the jars, amplified by the chamber's acoustics. I stood there, frozen, my flashlight beam shaking in my hand. This wasn't a kidnapping. This wasn't a political maneuver. This was something else entirely, something beyond comprehension. One of the robed figures turned towards me, its hood falling back slightly, revealing a glimpse of a face. It wasn't human. The skin was pale and stretched taut over sharp bones, the eyes black and soulless. A long, thin tongue flickered out from between needle-sharp teeth. It hissed, a sound that scraped against my eardrums. The chanting stopped abruptly. The other figures turned, their hooded faces swiveling towards me. The air crackled with an unnatural energy. I knew, with a chilling certainty, that I had stumbled upon something ancient and evil, something that had been lurking beneath the Vatican for centuries. I had come to assassinate the Pope, but now I realized the Pope was the least of my worries. My hand tightened around the silenced pistol in my pocket. I was outnumbered, outmatched, and trapped in a subterranean chamber with something that defied explanation. But I was still an assassin, and I still had a job to do. It just wasn't the job I'd originally planned. The creature that had hissed stepped forward, its black eyes burning into me. The others followed, their movements slow and deliberate, like predators stalking their prey. The metallic smell intensified, choking the air. The jars lining the walls pulsed with a sickening rhythm, I raised my pistol, the cold metal, a small comfort in the face of the unimaginable horror that surrounded me. I was no longer an assassin sent to kill the Pope. I was a soldier, fighting for my survival against an enemy that shouldn't exist. And I knew, deep in my heart, that I was probably going to die. But I would die fighting. I would die trying to unravel the terrifying secret hidden beneath St. Peter's Basilica. I would die trying to understand what I had found. Something worse. Much, much worse. I pressed myself against the cold stone, the rough texture scraping against my back. The chanting had stopped, leaving a ringing silence more oppressive than the sound itself. The scent of incense, usually so comforting, now felt cloying, thick with an unnatural sweetness. My hand instinctively went to the dagger strapped to my thigh, a cold comfort against the growing dread. Peering around the corner, I saw the chamber. It was circular, much larger than I'd anticipated, with a high domed ceiling lost in shadows. Torches flickered in sconces along the walls, casting, dancing, grotesque shapes. In the center stood an altar, draped in crimson velvet, but it wasn't the altar that drew my gaze. It was what lay upon it. Not the Pope. A large, oblong object lay covered by a silken cloth, the shape vaguely familiar, yet unsettling. Around it, the cardinals stood, their faces pale and drawn, their eyes fixed on the shrouded form. They weren't chanting now, but their lips moved silently, as if in fervent, internal prayer. I had studied the layout of the Vatican for months, memorized every corridor, every chamber. This room wasn't on any plan, it shouldn't exist. My initial mission, assassinating the Pope, now seemed almost trivial compared to the chilling mystery unfolding before me. Fear, cold and viscous, coiled in my gut. This wasn't political intrigue, this was something else. Slowly, cautiously, I edged further into the chamber, keeping to the shadows. The cardinals remained oblivious to my presence, their focus entirely consumed by the object on the altar. I could hear their shallow breathing, the rustle of their robes, the frantic thumping of my own heart. As I drew closer, I could see details beneath the silken shroud. A curved edge here, a sharp angle there. The shape coalesced in my mind, triggering a jolt of horrified recognition. It resembled a rib cage, enormous, impossibly large. One of the cardinals, a man with a gaunt face and feverish eyes, stepped forward. He reached out a trembling hand and grasped the edge of the silken cloth. He hesitated for a moment, then, with a deep breath, pulled it back. My breath hitched. The air thickened, the temperature plummeting as if a glacial wind had swept through the chamber. The scent of incense intensified, becoming nauseatingly sweet, with an underlying metallic tang. It wasn't a rib cage. It was an asterisk cage of ribs. Interlocking bones, gleaming white and impossibly smooth, formed a structure the size of a small cart. Within this macabre cage, nestled amongst the skeletal bars, lay a pulsating mass of flesh. It throbbed rhythmically, a sickening, wet beat echoing in the sudden silence. The cardinals began to chant again, their voices low and guttural, a sound that resonated deep within my bones. The fleshy mass within the ribcage pulsed faster, its surface rippling, as if something were trying to break free. I wanted to scream, to run, to claw my way back through the secret passages and never look back. But I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by a morbid fascination. The cardinal who had unveiled the thing now raised his hands above his head. He held a small obsidian knife, its blade glinting in the torchlight. He began to chant louder, his voice rising above the others, a frenzied incantation in a language I didn't understand, but felt in the marrow of my being. He brought the knife down, not towards the pulsating mass, but to his own wrist. He sliced deep, a crimson line appearing on his pale skin. Blood welled up, thick and dark, and he held his bleeding wrist over the rib cage. The other cardinals followed suit, each cutting themselves, each offering their blood to the pulsating mass. The air crackled with an unseen energy, the torches flickering wildly, casting distorted shadows that danced across the walls like demons. The fleshy mass within the ribcage pulsed faster and faster, growing larger, its surface now covered in a network of pulsing veins. It began to emit a low humming sound, a vibration that shook the very foundations of the chamber. Suddenly, the chanting stopped. The cardinals lowered their bleeding wrists, their faces rapturous, their eyes glazed over. The humming intensified, the air shimmering around the ribcage. A crack appeared in one of the smooth white bones, then another, and another. The ribcage began to crumble, the bones disintegrating into dust. The pulsating mass within expanded, pushing outwards, its surface now slick with blood and something else, something that shimmered, something that writhed. I couldn't breathe, my vision blurred. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the core, that whatever was emerging from that shattered cage of bones was far more dangerous than any pope, any political conspiracy, any earthly threat. I had come to the Vatican to kill a man, but I had stumbled upon something ancient, something monstrous, something that should have remained locked away, hidden in the shadows, and now it was free. My hand tightened on the hilt of my dagger. It was a pathetically inadequate weapon against the horror unfolding before me, but it was all I had. I knew, with a sinking dread, that my mission had changed. I was no longer an assassin. I was prey. The chamber beyond the iron door pulsed with an unnatural warmth. It wasn't the stifling heat of hellfire I'd half expected, but something organic, sickeningly fecund. The air, thick with a metallic tang of blood, and something else, something sweet, clung to my skin like a shroud. I held the flickering lantern higher, its light dancing over grotesque frescoes adorning the walls. They depicted not angels and saints, but twisted, fleshy forms, intertwined in obscene embraces. Creatures with too many limbs and eyes stared back at me, their expressions shifting in the wavering light, mocking my fear. My hand tightened around the hilt of my blade. The Pope, or whatever remained of him, was somewhere in this fetid womb. I advanced slowly, my boots echoing on the smooth, strangely yielding floor. It felt fleshy. The realization sent a shiver down my spine. I tried to convince myself it was just damp stone, but the subtle give beneath each step, the faint, almost imperceptible pulsation, betrayed a more sinister truth. The chamber opened into a vast circular space. In the center, bathed in a sickly yellow light emanating from an unseen source, was an altar, but it wasn't marble or gold. It was a mound of pulsating flesh, crisscrossed with veins thick as pythons, throbbing with a slow, rhythmic beat. And atop this thing sat the Pope. Or rather, what was left of him. His papal vestments were tattered and stained, clinging to a skeletal frame. His skin, stretched taut over bone, was a sickly yellow, almost translucent. His eyes, huge and black, were fixed on the ceiling, devoid of any light, any recognition. He didn't seem to notice my presence. He didn't seem to notice anything. He was a husk, a puppet. Around the fleshy altar, figures moved in a slow, hypnotic dance. They were robed, their faces obscured by deep cowls. At first, I thought they were cardinals, but as I drew closer, I saw the unnatural angles of their limbs, the way their robes seemed to flow and shift around forms that were wrong. They chanted in a low, guttural tongue, a sound that resonated deep in my bones, a sound that spoke of ancient, unspeakable things. I recognized the scent now, the sweet, cloying odor that permeated the chamber. It was the smell of decay, yes, but also growth. Like a garden festering, life and death intertwined in a grotesque parody of nature. One of the robed figures stopped chanting, turning to face me. The hood fell back, revealing a face that was both human and other. The skin was smooth and pale, stretched tight over sharp, angular features. The eyes were large and black, like the Pope's, but these burned with an unnerving intelligence. A thin, lipless mouth curved into a smile that sent chills down my spine. It spoke, its voice a dry rustle, like leaves skittering across dry earth. "You have come. He has been expecting you." My hand instinctively went to the holy symbol beneath my tunic. It burned against my skin, a searing reminder of the faith I was sworn to protect, the faith that had sent me here to kill. But in this unholy place, surrounded by this, I felt the power of that faith dwindle, like a candle flame flickering in a storm. "Where is the Pope?" I demanded, my voice trembling slightly. The creature gestured towards the skeletal figure atop the fleshy altar. "He is Ascending! Ascending? I scoffed. He looks more like he's dying. The creature's smile widened, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. Death is a doorway, a transition. He is shedding his mortal coil, embracing a higher form. My gaze shifted to the pulsating mound of flesh beneath the Pope. The veins throbbed, the surface rippled. It looked alive, and the Pope, or what was left of him, seemed to be sinking into it, being absorbed by it. "What is that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible above the low chanting of the robed figures. "The vessel," the creature hissed. "The conduit, the bridge between worlds." The chanting intensified, the rhythm growing faster, more frantic. The fleshy altar pulsed with renewed vigor, the veins throbbing like a diseased heart. The Pope's skeletal form twitched, his head snapping back as a low, guttural moan escaped his lips. It wasn't human. It was something ancient, something alien. Terror, cold and sharp, gripped my heart. This wasn't a simple assassination. This was something far beyond my comprehension, something far beyond the scope of any earthly power. I had been sent to kill the Pope, to eliminate a threat to the Church, but I had stumbled upon something far, far worse, something that threatened not just the Church, but all of humanity. I had to get out, I had to warn them. But as I turned to flee, I felt a hand grip my arm. It was cold, impossibly strong. The robed creature stood before me, its black eyes burning into mine. "You cannot leave," it whispered, its voice a venomous caress. "You have seen too much. You are part of it now." The chanting reached a fever pitch. The fleshy altar pulsated with blinding speed. The Pope's skeletal form arched back, his mouth opening in a silent scream. And from the depths of that gaping maw something began to emerge. Something vast, something dark, something unholy. I knew then that I had made a terrible mistake. I had come to kill the Pope. But the Pope was already dead, and something far worse had taken his place. I pressed my ear against the cold stone, the chills seeping into my cheek. The chanting had stopped, abruptly. One moment, the rhythmic murmur. The next, a silence so profound, it pressed against my eardrums. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs. This unnatural quiet was more unsettling than the chanting. It spoke of something holding its breath, something waiting. Hesitantly, I pushed open the heavy oak door. The hinges groaned. A mournful sound that echoed in the vast chamber. The air inside was thick with the scent of incense, but beneath it, a faint metallic tang lingered, something coppery and acrid. My stomach churned. The chamber was circular, the walls lined with towering bookshelves crammed with ancient tomes. In the center, a single candle flickered on a small, stone altar. Its light barely penetrated the gloom, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe and shift like living things. But the Pope wasn't there, nor were his guards. I scanned the room again, my hand instinctively reaching for the knife hidden beneath my cloak. The silence pressed in, amplifying the frantic beat of my heart. Where were they? Had they discovered me? The thought sent a shiver down my spine. Then I saw it, a small, dark stain on the floor near the altar. I approached cautiously, my breath catching in my throat. It was blood, fresh blood. A low growl echoed from the shadows in the corner of the room. My blood ran cold. Slowly, I turned my gaze towards the sound. The shadows seemed to deepen, coalescing into a dark, amorphous mass. I strained my eyes, trying to discern what lurked within. The growl came again, closer this time. A pair of eyes, glowing with an unnatural luminescence, emerged from the darkness. They weren't human eyes. They were large, round, and reptilian, reflecting the flickering candlelight with a malevolent gleam. A low hiss followed, and the creature stepped fully into the light. It was unlike anything I had ever seen. Its body was a grotesque parody of human form, twisted and contorted, covered in rough, gray skin. Long, sharp claws tipped its hands and feet. Its head was elongated, almost serpentine, with a wide, gaping maw filled with razor-sharp teeth. The creature stalked towards me, its movements fluid and unsettlingly silent. I backed away, my hand trembling as I gripped the hilt of my knife. This wasn't the Pope. This wasn't even human. What was this thing? Fear threatened to paralyze me, but the primal instinct for survival kicked in. I drew my knife, the steel glinting in the candlelight. The creature hissed again, its eyes fixated on me, and lunged. I ducked under its outstretched claws, the fetid air rushing past my face. The knife flashed, slicing across its arm. A black, viscous fluid, not blood, oozed from the wound. The creature shrieked, a high-pitched, ear-splitting sound that echoed through the chamber. It stumbled back, its glowing eyes burning with rage. I knew I couldn't stay here. This thing was beyond my comprehension, beyond my ability to kill. I had to get out, to warn someone. I turned and ran, dodging the creature's renewed attack. I burst through the heavy oak door, the hinges screaming in protest, and sprinted down the long corridor, the creature's shrieks echoing behind me. I didn't stop running. I ran through the labyrinthine corridors, my heart pounding in my chest. The image of the creature burned into my mind. I had to escape this place. I had to tell someone what I had seen. I finally reached the small, hidden door I had entered through. I fumbled with the latch, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The door swung open, and I stumbled out into the cool night air. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. I ran through the deserted streets, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The Vatican, the supposed holy sanctuary, was harboring something monstrous, something far more terrifying than any human assassin. I found a small, dimly lit tavern and collapsed onto a stool, ordering a strong drink. The tavern keeper eyed me with suspicion, but I ignored him. I needed the alcohol to calm my nerves, to numb the terror that still gripped me. As I drank, I replayed the events of the night in my mind. The chanting, the blood, the creature. It was all so surreal, so impossible. But I knew what I had seen. I knew what lurked beneath the Vatican. And I knew that my mission, my original purpose, was insignificant compared to the horror I had uncovered. The Pope's death, if he was even dead, was a mere trifle in the face of this monstrous entity. The world needed to know. But who would believe me? Who would believe the assassin who claimed to have seen a monster in the heart of the Vatican? I took another long swig of my drink, the bitter liquid burning its way down my throat. I was no longer an assassin. I was a witness. A witness to something truly horrific. And I knew, with a chilling certainty, that my life would never be the same. My mission had changed. I had to find a way to expose the truth, no matter the cost. Because what I had seen in the Vatican wasn't just a threat to the Pope, it was a threat to humanity. I pressed myself against the damp stone, the chills seeping through my black suit. The tunnels beneath the Vatican were a labyrinth of whispers and shadows, far older than the basilica above. My flashlight beam danced across ancient frescoes, depictions of saints now obscured by mildew, and the creeping dread that clung to this place like cobwebs. The rhythmic chanting, a distorted echo of the hymns above, continued, now laced with a guttural undertone that made my stomach churn. The air grew heavy, thick with the metallic tang of blood, overlaid by something else, something cloyingly sweet, like overripe fruit. I adjusted the silencer on my pistol, the metallic click unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. My mission, the Pope, seemed a distant memory, replaced by the visceral need to understand the horror unfolding beneath my feet. Following the chanting, I reached a vast chamber. My flashlight revealed a scene that defied logic, a grotesque mockery of faith. Hundreds of figures, robed in crimson, knelt in a circle around a pulsating mass of flesh. It throbbed with a sickening rhythm, mirroring the chant, veins of light pulsing across its surface. The sweet, putrid smell emanated from this thing. The robed figures were not chanting. They were prasheening, a low, mournful wail that resonated deep within my bones. Their faces, what I could see of them in the flickering light, were gaunt, eyes hollow and fixed on the pulsating mass. They were not human, not entirely. Their skin was too pale, too taut, stretched across their bones like parchment. My finger tightened on the trigger. Who were these creatures? And what was that thing they worshipped? The thought of firing, of disrupting this unholy ritual, sent a shiver of primal fear down my spine. I felt an overwhelming urge to retreat, to flee back through the tunnels, and never look back. But something held me rooted to the spot, a morbid fascination with the grotesque spectacle unfolding before me. As I watched, one of the robed figures rose. It moved with an unnatural grace, its crimson robe swirling around it like smoke. It approached the pulsating mass, its movements slow and deliberate. Then, in a movement that made my breath catch in my throat, it plunged its hand into the fleshy orb. A wave of the sweet, sickening smell washed over me, so intense it made me gag. The robed figure withdrew its hand, now dripping with a viscous, luminescent fluid. It turned to face the others, raising its hand high. The keening intensified, becoming a frenzied shriek. The robed figures pressed forward, their eyes gleaming with a terrifying hunger. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the core, that they were about to partake in some unholy communion. My stomach heaved. This wasn't a political assassination. This was something far more ancient, far more evil. I forced myself to move, to raise the pistol. I had to stop this. But, as I aimed, a voice, soft and insidious, whispered in my ear. "Join us." I froze. The voice was inside my head, echoing in the deepest recesses of my mind. It was a siren song, promising power, knowledge, belonging. I struggled against it, the pistol trembling in my hand. "Become one with us," the voice continued, its seductive tone weaving its way through my defenses. "Embrace the truth. Embrace the glory." I squeezed my eyes shut, fighting the urge to lower the weapon, to join the grotesque feast. The Pope, my mission, seemed inconsequential now, a distant whisper in the face of this overwhelming horror. "Resist." Another voice, faint and distant, echoed within my mind. It was a voice I recognized, a voice I had tried to bury deep within my subconscious. The voice of my handler, the one who had sent me on this mission. "Remember your purpose," the voice urged, growing stronger. "Remember who you are." The struggle within me intensified, a battle between the seductive whispers of the creature and the fading echoes of my own humanity. I opened my eyes, my vision blurring with unshed tears. The robed figure, its hand still dripping with the luminescent fluid, was now inches from me. Its hollow eyes met mine, and a chilling smile spread across its gaunt face. "It is too late," the creature whispered, its voice now a guttural rasp. "You are already ours." With a surge of adrenaline, fueled by the remnants of my will, I slammed the butt of the pistol into the creature's face. The sickening crunch of bone echoed through the chamber. The creature staggered back, its smile twisting into a grimace of rage. The keening stopped abruptly, replaced by a stunned silence. Hundreds of hollow eyes turned towards me, burning with a malevolent intensity. I knew I had made a terrible mistake. I had broken the spell. I had drawn their attention. And now I was prey. The chanting continued, a low, thrumming vibration that seemed to emanate from the very stones of the Vatican. I pressed myself against the cold, damp wall, the rough texture scraping against my skin. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The echoing chant, coupled with the oppressive silence between the rhythmic phrases, amplified the sense of impending doom. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the thin sliver of light escaping from under the heavy oak door I'd just managed to close. I strained my ears, trying to decipher the words. Latin, certainly, but twisted, corrupted. Familiar phrases mingled with guttural, unfamiliar sounds, creating a blasphemous symphony. I knew I had to get out, to warn someone, anyone, of what was happening beneath the gilded surface of the Vatican. But my legs felt like lead, my breath catching in my throat. The fear, a cold, viscous dread, was paralyzing. Slowly, inch by inch, I moved along the wall, feeling for a way out, an alternative to the door I'd just barricaded. My fingers brushed against something smooth and cold. Metal. A handle. Hope surged through me, fragile and fleeting. I gripped the handle and pulled. Locked. I rattled it, desperate. Then, I pressed my ear against the cold metal, listening. Silence. I held my breath, straining for any sound beyond the incessant chanting. Nothing. It was a dead end. Resigned, I slid down the wall, the rough stone digging into my back. The chanting grew louder, closer. Panic clawed at the edges of my sanity. I had stumbled upon something ancient, something unholy, and I was trapped. A low growl, deep and resonant, reverberated through the passage. It wasn't human. The chanting faltered, replaced by a chorus of whispers, sibilant and chilling. The whispers coalesced into a unified voice, speaking in a language that predated words, a language of instinct and primal fear. My hand instinctively went to the knife strapped to my thigh. It offered little comfort. What could a blade do against whatever that was? A shadow flickered under the door, long and distorted. Then another, and another. They writhed and pulsed, like tentacles reaching out from the abyss. The heavy oak groaned under the pressure. I knew it wouldn't hold for long. Driven by desperation, I began to search the wall again, running my hands over every inch of cold stone. I needed a way out, a miracle. My fingers brushed against something small and almost imperceptible. A slight indentation in the stone. I pressed it. A section of the wall shifted, revealing a narrow passage. With a silent prayer of thanks, I squeezed through the opening, the stone scraping against my sides. The passage was pitch black, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and something else, something acrid and metallic, like blood. I fumbled for my lighter, the small flame casting flickering shadows that danced on the rough-hewn walls. The passage sloped downwards, leading deeper into the earth. The chanting faded, replaced by the steady drip, drip, drip of water. As I descended, the air grew colder, the smell of blood stronger. The passage opened into a large cavern, the ceiling lost in the impenetrable darkness above. In the center of the cavern, a single flickering torch illuminated a grotesque tableau. An altar, crafted from bone and blackened stone, stood at the far end of the cavern. Upon it lay a figure, shrouded in white cloth. Around the altar, a circle of figures knelt, their faces obscured by hooded robes. They were chanting again, their voices a low, guttural drone. But it was the figures surrounding the kneeling circle that stole my breath. Twisted, grotesque creatures, their flesh a pallid gray, their eyes glowing with an unholy light. They moved with an unsettling fluidity, their limbs contorting at unnatural angles. Some were humanoid, others not. They were the things that cast the shadows under the door, the source of the growls and whispers. I watched, frozen in horror, as one of the robed figures rose and approached the altar. He lifted the white cloth, revealing the figure beneath. It was the Pope, but his eyes were open, staring blankly ahead. His skin was ashen, his lips drawn back in a rictus grin. The robed figure raised a dagger, the blade glinting in the torchlight. He plunged it into the Pope's chest, not once, but repeatedly. The chanting intensified, reaching a fever pitch. The grotesque creatures surrounding the circle began to sway and writhe, their movements growing more frantic. Then the Pope sat up, his eyes, still vacant, fixed on the ceiling. He opened his mouth, and a voice, not his own, echoed through the cavern. It was the voice I had heard in the confessional, the voice that had spoken of things best left undisturbed. "The time has come," the voice boomed, resonating with power and malice. "The awakening is at hand." The chanting ceased. The creatures surrounding the circle fell silent, their glowing eyes fixed on the Pope. He raised his arms, and a wave of palpable energy surged through the cavern. The ground trembled. The air crackled with an unseen force. I knew, with a chilling certainty, that I had not only failed to assassinate the Pope, but I had also unleashed something far, far worse. Something that threatened not just the Vatican, but the entire world. And I was trapped in the heart of it, a witness to the birth of an unspeakable horror. The chanting grew louder, weaving itself into the very fabric of the Vatican walls. It pulsed, a rhythmic thrumming against my skin, a relentless whisper against my sanity. I pressed further into the shadowed alcove, the cold stone, a meager comfort against the rising tide of dread. My hand instinctively went to the hilt of my silenced pistol, the metal cold and reassuring beneath my sweaty palm. It wouldn't do much good against that, whatever that was. I peeked out from my hiding place. The Swiss guards, normally stoic and impenetrable, were swaying slightly, their halberds held loosely at their sides, their eyes glazed over. They looked entranced. The chanting seemed to emanate from the Sistine Chapel itself, a low, guttural sound that vibrated through the floor. I had to get closer. I had to see. The corridor leading to the chapel was deserted. The air crackled with an unseen energy, a palpable sense of wrongness that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Each step I took felt heavy, as though I were wading through thick molasses. The closer I got, the more intense the chanting became, interspersed now with a wet, slithering sound that churned my stomach. Finally, I reached the massive doors of the Sistine Chapel. They were slightly ajar, a sliver of light escaping from within. I took a deep breath, steeling my nerves, and pushed the doors open. The sight that greeted me was indescribable. It was a perversion of everything holy, a mockery of faith. The frescoes, Michelangelo's masterpieces, seemed to writhe and contort, the figures within them twisting into grotesque parodies of their former glory. The air was thick with the smell of incense, but it was a corrupted incense, acrid and nauseating. And then there was the thing. It dominated the center of the chapel, a pulsating mass of flesh and bone, draped in papal vestments. It wasn't the Pope. It was bigger, much bigger. Its skin was stretched taut over what looked like an impossibly large skeletal structure, the bones protruding at unnatural angles. Tendrils of something dark and viscous dripped from its gaping maw, pooling on the marble floor. The cardinals, normally arrayed in their crimson robes, were prostrate before it, their faces buried in the ground. They were chanting, their voices hoarse and broken, fueling the monstrous thing in the center of the chapel. The wet, slithering sound I had heard earlier was coming from the creature itself, a rhythmic pulsing that seemed to synchronize with the chanting. It was growing. I could see it expanding, its flesh rippling and distorting, its bones shifting and cracking. With each pulse, it became larger, more grotesque, more unholy. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. I wanted to empty my pistol into the monstrous thing. But I was frozen, paralyzed by the sheer horror of it all. My assassin's training, years of conditioning, had vanished, replaced by a primal fear that burrowed deep into my soul. Suddenly, the chanting stopped. The creature, now twice the size it had been when I first entered, turned its massive head towards me. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, were empty sockets filled with a swirling darkness. It fixed its gaze on me, and a wave of pure, unadulterated malevolence washed over me. I felt a pressure in my mind, a voice whispering, not with words but with pure intent. It was ancient, vast, and utterly alien. It spoke of power, of dominion, of a hunger that could never be satisfied. It offered me a choice. Join it. Become part of its grotesque ascension, or be consumed. My hand trembled on the hilt of my pistol. My mind screamed in protest, but my body, betraying me, began to move towards the creature. I felt my lips parting, ready to join the chanting, ready to embrace the darkness. Then, a faint whisper, barely audible above the pounding of my heart, echoed through the chapel. It was a single word, spoken in a familiar voice, a voice I thought I would never hear again. Father. It was the Pope. He was slumped against the base of the altar, his white robes stained with blood, his body broken and bruised. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and pleading, and in that moment, the hold the creature had on me weakened. The voice in my mind roared in frustration, the pressure intensifying. But the Pope's whisper, weak as it was, had anchored me, reminding me of my mission, reminding me of what was at stake. I ripped my gaze away from the creature and focused on the Pope. He was barely conscious, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He mouthed another word, his voice too weak to carry. "Run!" The creature shrieked, a sound that ripped through the air, shattering the stained glass windows and sending shards of colored glass raining down on us. It lunged towards me, its massive form blotting out the light. I raised my pistol. This wasn't about the contract anymore. This wasn't about the Vatican. This was about survival. This was about humanity. This was about fighting back against the encroaching darkness. And I was no longer an assassin. I was its first line of defense. The chanting swelled, vibrating the very stone beneath my feet. The rhythmic thumping from below the altar seemed to synchronize with it, a perverse heartbeat echoing the inhuman litany. I pressed myself further back into the shadows, the damp chill of the catacombs seeping into my bones. My hand instinctively went to the crucifix beneath my shirt, a cold, useless comfort. Whatever was down there wasn't something faith could touch. I'd seen the Swiss guard dragged down, their screams abruptly cut short, swallowed by the earth. I'd seen the cardinal, his face a mask of serene acceptance, descend into the darkness willingly, his eyes fixed on something I couldn't see, something beyond human comprehension. Now, only the chanting remained, rising and falling like a tide of madness. I had to see what was down there. My initial mission, the assassination, had become utterly insignificant. This was something else entirely, something that gnawed at the edges of reality, threatening to unravel everything I thought I knew. Slowly, painstakingly, I began to descend the worn stone steps. The air grew heavier, thick with the stench of mildew and something else. Something ancient and sickeningly sweet. The chanting grew louder, pressing against my eardrums, resonating within my skull. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the faint, flickering glow of torches far below. Each step felt like a descent into hell itself. My breath caught in my throat, my heart hammering against my ribs. I gripped the hilt of my knife, the cold steel a small reassurance in the face of the unknown. As I neared the bottom, the chanting ceased. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any sound. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, pregnant with an unseen horror. The rhythmic thumping, however, continued, now louder, closer. Thump, thump, thump. The flickering torchlight revealed a vast, subterranean chamber. A grotesque altar dominated the space, carved from a single piece of dark, oily stone. Strange symbols, unlike anything I'd ever seen, were etched into its surface, pulsing with a faint, internal light. Around the altar, robed figures prostrated themselves, their faces hidden, their bodies trembling. The thumping emanated from beneath the altar, a steady, sickening pulse. My eyes scanned the chamber, searching for the Swiss guard, for the cardinal. I found nothing, no bodies, no signs of struggle. They had simply vanished. Then I saw it. At the foot of the altar, a single figure stood. It was the Pope, but he was different. His eyes glowed with an unnatural light. His skin seemed translucent, revealing the pulsing veins beneath. He held a small obsidian dagger in his hand, its tip pointed towards the altar. He began to speak, his voice not his own, a rasping, guttural whisper that echoed through the chamber. I couldn't understand the words, but they felt like a violation, a tearing of the fabric of reality. The robed figures around the altar began to chant again, their voices rising in a crescendo of madness. The thumping beneath the altar grew faster, stronger. The Pope raised the obsidian dagger, its tip glowing with an eerie crimson light. He plunged the dagger into the altar. The chamber erupted in a blinding flash of light and a deafening roar. I shielded my eyes, stumbling back, the very ground trembling beneath my feet. The chanting stopped. The thumping ceased. When I could see again, the chamber was different. The air shimmered, distorted, as if reality itself was bending. The altar pulsed with a sickening, violet light. The Pope stood before it, his arms outstretched, his eyes closed. The robed figures were gone. And then, from beneath the altar, something began to emerge. It was indescribable, a mass of writhing tentacles, glistening with an oily sheen. Eyes, dozens of them, blinked open, staring at me with malevolent intelligence. A gaping maw opened, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth. It was a creature from a nightmare, a thing that should not exist. The Pope opened his eyes and smiled, a chilling, inhuman smile that stretched his lips into a grotesque parody of joy. "He has awakened," he whispered, his voice still that rasping, guttural whisper, "and he is hungry." The creature lurched forward, its tentacles reaching, grasping. I turned and ran, my mind screaming, my body fueled by pure terror. I scrambled up the stone steps, the creature's roars echoing behind me. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I burst out of the catacombs and into the cold night air, gasping for breath, my lungs burning. I stumbled through the Vatican gardens, my mind reeling, trying to comprehend what I had just witnessed. The Pope hadn't needed to be assassinated. He was already gone, replaced by something else, something far worse. And now, it was loose. The chanting grew louder, a guttural rhythmic thrum that vibrated through the very stone of the Vatican. I pressed myself further into the shadows of the tapestry, the coarse fabric scratching against my cheek. The flickering candlelight cast grotesque, dancing shadows across the hidden chamber's walls, making the already disturbing frescoes seem to writhe and pulsate. They depicted scenes I couldn't quite comprehend, figures with elongated limbs and vacant eyes, performing rituals around a central, pulsating mass of darkness. I risked a glance through a slit in the tapestry. Cardinal Bellini stood before the altar, his face bathed in an unholy light. He was no longer the frail, elderly man I'd encountered in the gardens. His eyes burned with an unnatural intensity, and his movements were fluid, almost serpentine. He raised his hands above his head, and the chanting intensified, reaching a fever pitch that seemed to bore into my skull. The air crackled with an unseen energy. The scent of incense, usually soothing, now choked me with its cloying sweetness. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on it. The sense of dread I'd felt since entering the Vatican had solidified into a cold, hard knot in my stomach. This wasn't just a religious ceremony, it was something else. Bellini began to speak in a language I didn't recognize. It wasn't Latin, nor any of the common tongues I'd encountered in my travels. It sounded ancient, guttural, like the grinding of tectonic plates. With each syllable, the pulsating darkness on the altar seemed to grow, expanding outwards like a living thing. Then, I saw it. Within the darkness, a shape began to coalesce. It was humanoid, but impossibly tall and thin, with limbs that seemed to bend at unnatural angles. Its head was elongated, almost reptilian, and its eyes glowed with a cold, malevolent intelligence. The chanting stopped abruptly. A silence descended upon the chamber so profound, it felt like a physical pressure against my eardrums. Bellini prostrated himself before the creature, his voice a trembling whisper. I couldn't hear what he said, but the reverence, the sheer terror in his posture, spoke volumes. The creature extended a hand, impossibly long and skeletal, towards Bellini. A single, elongated finger touched the cardinal's forehead. Bellini's body convulsed, his back arching as a silent scream contorted his features. Then, just as quickly, he went still. The creature withdrew its hand. Bellini remained prostrate, unmoving. I held my breath, my heart pounding against my ribs. I had to get out of there, to warn someone, anyone, of what I'd witnessed. But my legs felt like lead, my body frozen in place by a primal fear I'd never known before. The creature turned its head, its glowing eyes scanning the chamber. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that it could see me, even through the tapestry. It began to move towards me, its step silent and unsettlingly graceful. The tapestry swayed slightly as it approached, the air growing colder with each step. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying that it would pass me by, that it would somehow mistake me for part of the wall, part of the shadows. But the creature stopped directly in front of the tapestry. I could feel its presence, a radiating coldness that seemed to drain the heat from my very being. I felt a sharp tug on the fabric, a single, skeletal finger pulling it aside. I opened my eyes. The creature stood before me, its face inches from mine. Its skin was the color of parchment, stretched taut over its bone structure. Its eyes, those terrifyingly intelligent eyes, burned into mine, seeming to see straight through me, to dissect my very soul. It opened its mouth, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. A low, guttural growl emanated from its throat, a sound that resonated deep within my chest, shaking me to my core. Then it spoke. Its voice was not the ancient, grinding language I'd heard earlier. It spoke in perfect, accented Italian, its words laced with a chilling amusement. "You were sent to kill the Pope," it said, its voice a dry rasp. How disappointing. My mind raced, scrambling for a response, for any way to escape this nightmare. But I could only stare into those glowing eyes, paralyzed by fear. The creature leaned closer, its breath cold against my face. "The Pope is no longer necessary," it whispered, its voice a venomous caress. "I have other plans." Its hand, still impossibly long and skeletal, reached out, its fingers brushing against my cheek. The touch was like ice, burning and numbing at the same time. I felt a sharp pain in my arm, a searing sensation that spread quickly throughout my body. I looked down and saw a small, puncture wound, oozing a black, viscous fluid. The creature smiled, a grotesque, predatory expression that stretched its thin lips across its needle-like teeth. "Welcome," it hissed, its voice dripping with malice, "to the new order." Then everything went black. I stumbled back. the scent of decay clinging to the air like a shroud. The chamber, previously veiled in shadow, was now bathed in the sickly green luminescence emanating from the thing before me. It wasn't the Pope. Not anymore. His vestments, once pristine white, were tattered and stained a vile brownish black. His skin, stretched taut over bone, seemed to shimmer with an unnatural, almost iridescent sheen. But it was his eyes that truly horrified. They were no longer the kind eyes I remembered from the newsreels, replaced instead by orbs of pulsating, emerald fire. They burned into me, ancient and knowing. You're not him," I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. The gun in my hand trembled, useless. The creature smiled, a grotesque parody of human expression. Its lips peeled back, revealing teeth that were far too long, far too sharp. He was him. It hissed, its voice a grating rasp that seemed to claw at my sanity. But the shepherd has evolved. I felt a creeping dread, an icy tendril winding its way around my spine. "The shepherd?" I repeated, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. The creature took a step towards me, its movements unsettlingly fluid, like a marionette controlled by unseen strings. "The shepherd guides the flock," it said, its voice dripping with a sickening sweetness. "And the flock needs to be purified." I raised the gun, my finger tightening on the trigger. "Stay back!" I yelled, my voice cracking with fear. The creature paused, tilting its head as if considering my threat. Then it let out a chilling laugh, a sound that echoed through the chamber, bouncing off the ancient stones. "You think that can harm me?" it sneered. "You misunderstand the nature of my ascension." Suddenly the green light intensified, and I felt a searing pain in my head, a pressure building behind my eyes. Images flooded my mind, chaotic and terrifying. I saw flashes of grotesque rituals, chanting figures cloaked in shadow, and rivers of blood flowing beneath the Vatican. I saw the Pope, writhing in agony as something entered him. I screamed, dropping the gun as I clutched my head in my hands. The visions intensified, becoming more vivid, more real. I saw the creature before me, growing larger, its form shifting and contorting, becoming something else, something vast and ancient and utterly inhuman. When the visions finally subsided, I collapsed to my knees, gasping for breath. The creature stood before me, its emerald eyes burning into my soul. It reached out a hand, its long, skeletal fingers brushing against my cheek. "Join us," it whispered, its voice now a chorus of 1,000 whispers, each one promising power and oblivion. "Become one with the shepherd. Embrace the purification." I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. I couldn't speak, couldn't even scream. All I could feel was the overwhelming terror, the suffocating dread. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that I was facing something far older, far more powerful than anything I could have ever imagined. The creature's smile widened, revealing its monstrous teeth. "Resistance is futile," it hissed. "The shepherd will claim all." Then it moved with a speed that defied human comprehension. One moment it was standing before me, the next it was upon me, its skeletal fingers digging into my flesh. I felt a sharp, searing pain in my chest, as if something was tearing its way through my ribs. I looked down and saw, to my horror, that the creature's hand had sunk deep into my chest cavity. I choked back a sob, the world around me blurring. I felt something cold and slimy writhing within me, something that was rapidly replacing my own organs, my own being. The emerald light intensified, engulfing me in its sickly glow. I knew with a terrifying clarity that I was losing myself, becoming something other. The creature leaned in close, its fetid breath hot against my ear. "Welcome," it whispered, its voice now echoing within my own skull. "Welcome to the flock." My vision began to fade, the world dissolving into a swirling vortex of green light. I could feel the creature's essence merging with mine, its consciousness intertwining with my own. I tried to fight, to cling to the remnants of my humanity, but it was no use. The shepherd was claiming me, body and soul. As darkness finally consumed me, I heard a single chilling thought echo through the newly formed void within my mind. The purification has begun, and then nothing. The chanting grew louder, vibrating through the very stone beneath my feet, I pressed myself tighter against the shadowed alcove, the rough stone scraping against my back. The scent of incense, normally comforting, was now cloying, thick, with an undercurrent of something metallic, something I couldn't quite place. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the rhythmic chanting of the unseen choir. I peeked again, just the slightest sliver of my eye past the edge of the alcove. The chamber had been transformed. The simple altar I'd seen before was now draped in crimson velvet, embroidered with symbols I didn't recognize. Intricate, swirling patterns that seemed to shift and writhe even in the flickering candlelight. The candles themselves were a sickly yellow, their flames dancing with an unnatural fervor, casting long, distorted shadows that danced across the walls like spectral figures. And then there was the Pope. He stood before the altar, no longer the frail, elderly man I remembered. He was taller now, his posture straighter, radiating an unsettling vitality. His eyes, usually filled with a gentle sadness, blazed with an almost inhuman light. He wore a crimson robe similar to the altar cloth, the strange symbols shimmering upon its surface. His hands, raised in supplication, were no longer wrinkled and age-spotted, but smooth and youthful, almost glowing. The chanting reached a crescendo, and the Pope began to speak. It wasn't Latin nor any language I'd ever heard. It was a guttural, rhythmic series of sounds that resonated deep within my chest, making my teeth ache and the hairs on my arms stand on end. The air grew thick, oppressive, charged with an unseen energy. I had to get out. This was far beyond my initial mission. The Pope wasn't merely being manipulated. He was undergoing a transformation, something terrifying and unholy. But my legs felt heavy, rooted to the spot. A strange fascination, a morbid curiosity, held me captive. Suddenly the chanting stopped. A silence descended upon the chamber, thick and heavy, broken only by the crackling of the unnatural flames. The Pope lowered his hands, his glowing eyes sweeping across the room. I held my breath, certain he could see me, feel my presence in the shadows. Then he spoke again, this time in a voice that was both familiar and alien. It was the Pope's voice, yet deeper, resonant, imbued with an unnatural power. "He is here," he said, the words echoing through the chamber. My blood ran cold. He knew I was there. Panic seized me. I stumbled back, my hand scrabbling for the knife hidden beneath my cloak. I had to get out, had to warn someone, anyone. But before I could make a move, a figure emerged from the shadows behind the altar. It was Cardinal Orsini, but like the Pope, he was different. His face was gaunt, almost skeletal, his eyes burning with the same unsettling light. He held a long, silver knife in his hand, the blade glinting in the candlelight. "You have witnessed too much," Orsini hissed, his voice a rasping whisper. I lunged, drawing my own knife, ready to fight for my life. But as our blades clashed, I felt a strange weakness in my arm. The air seemed to shimmer around Orsini, and I realized with a jolt of horror that he was moving with unnatural speed. He parried my attack with ease, his knife slicing across my forearm. A searing pain shot up my arm, and I cried out, stumbling back. He advanced, his eyes burning into mine, a predatory gleam in their depths. "The transformation is almost complete," Orsini whispered, his voice dripping with malice. "Soon, the world will be reborn." He lunged again, and I barely managed to deflect his blow. My back hit the cold stone wall, trapping me. I knew I was outmatched. He was stronger, faster, driven by some unholy power I couldn't comprehend. What is happening?" I stammered, my voice choked with fear. Orsini smiled, a cruel, chilling expression that sent shivers down my spine. "He is coming," he said, his gaze fixed on something beyond me, over my shoulder. "He is coming to claim his own." I turned, my heart pounding in my chest, and then I saw it. A shape was coalescing in the air behind the altar, a swirling mass of shadows and light. It was amorphous, constantly shifting, yet I could sense a malevolent intelligence within it, a power that made my soul recoil in terror. The chanting began again, louder this time, a cacophony of voices that seemed to tear at the very fabric of reality. The air crackled with energy, and the shadows danced with renewed frenzy. The shape behind the altar grew larger, more defined, taking on a vaguely humanoid form. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that whatever this was, it was far more dangerous than anything I could have imagined. My mission, the Pope, everything paled in comparison to the horror that was unfolding before my eyes. I was no longer an assassin. I was a witness, trapped in a nightmare from which there seemed to be no escape. Orsini raised his knife, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. "Embrace the new world," he hissed. "Embrace the coming of." His words were cut short by a deafening roar that erupted from the shape behind the altar. The ground trembled beneath my feet, and the candles exploded, plunging the chamber into darkness. I screamed, the sound lost in the chaos, as the horror descended. The chanting stopped abruptly, the silence heavier than the echoing Latin had been. My breath hitched, clinging in my throat like a spiderweb. The figure on the altar, bathed in flickering candlelight, remained still, its outline blurred by the swirling incense. I strained to see, my eyes burning with the effort. The scent of sanctity, that cloying mix of frankincense, myrrh, and something else, something sickly sweet, thickened the air, making it hard to breathe. Then, slowly, it moved. The figure unfurled, rising from its prostrate position. It wasn't the Pope. The robes were too ornate, too alien. They shimmered with an unnatural luminescence, woven with threads of silver that seemed to pulse with their own internal light. A crown, not the papal tiara, but a grotesque, spiky diadem of bone, adorned its head. And the face. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing the image away, but it was burned into my retinas. Skin stretched taut, over bone, eyes hollow and black as pitch, a gaping maw filled with needle-sharp teeth. It was a mockery of humanity, a twisted caricature of the divine. It raised a hand, skeletal fingers adorned with rings that pulsed with the same unholy light as its robes. A voice, raspy and dry as the whisper of dead leaves, filled the basilica. It wasn't Latin, nor any language I recognized. It was a series of guttural clicks and hisses, punctuated by low, resonant drones that vibrated in my very bones. The cardinals, still prostrate, began to tremble. A low, whimpering sound escaped one of them, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror. Then, one by one, they began to rise. Their movements were jerky and unnatural, like puppets on fraying strings. Their eyes, wide and vacant, fixed on the figure on the altar, with an unnerving intensity. Terror, cold and sharp, pierced through the numbness that had held me captive. I had to get out. I had to warn someone, anyone, of what was happening within the hallowed halls of the Vatican. But my legs felt like lead, my body frozen in place by an unseen force. The creature on the altar continued its chanting, the alien sounds weaving themselves into a hypnotic rhythm. The cardinals, now standing in a semicircle around the altar, began to sway in time with the chanting, their movements growing more fluid, more ritualistic. I forced myself to move, inching backwards towards the shadows that clung to the edges of the basilica. My hand brushed against something cold and smooth. The discarded rifle. I grabbed it, the familiar weight offering a small measure of comfort. As I retreated further into the shadows, I noticed something else. The paintings on the walls, depicting scenes of biblical grandeur, were changing. The faces of the saints and angels were contorting, morphing into grotesque parodies of their former selves. Their eyes, once serene and compassionate, now burned with a malevolent glee. The vibrant colors of the frescoes bled and swirled, transforming the scenes of divine grace into nightmarish tableaux of suffering and despair. The creature on the altar raised its skeletal hand again, silencing the chanting. The cardinals froze, their vacant eyes still fixed on their unholy master. A hush fell over the basilica, broken only by the faint crackling of the candles and the frantic beating of my own heart. The creature spoke again, its voice now clearer, amplified by some unseen force. It was still not a language I understood, but I felt the meaning of its words in the deepest recesses of my being. It spoke of power, of domination, of a world reshaped in its own twisted image. Then it pointed a bony finger directly at me. The cardinals turned in unison, their vacant eyes now locked on mine. A low growl, guttural and animalistic, emanated from their throats. They began to advance, their movements slow and deliberate, like predators stalking their prey. I raised the rifle, my finger hovering over the trigger. Could I shoot them? These men, once holy servants of God, now twisted into something other? But the look in their eyes, the pure, unadulterated malice, left me no choice. I fired. The shot echoed through the basilica, the sound amplified by the vastness of the space. One of the cardinals fell, clutching at its chest, a black ichor oozing from the wound. But the others continued to advance, undeterred by the death of their companion. I fired again and again, the rifle bucking in my hands. The cardinals fell, one by one, their bodies twitching and convulsing on the marble floor. The air filled with the coppery tang of blood and the acrid smell of burning flesh. Finally, they were all down. Silence descended once more, heavy and oppressive. I lowered the rifle, my hands shaking, my breath coming in ragged gasps. But I knew it wasn't over. The creature on the altar was still there, its eyes burning with an unholy light. It was waiting. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that this was just the beginning. The creature descended from the altar, its robes flowing around it like shadows. It approached me slowly, deliberately, its skeletal hand outstretched. The bone crown on its head seemed to pulse with a sickly green light. As it drew closer, I could smell the stench of decay emanating from it, a smell that clung to the back of my throat, choking me. It stopped just a few feet away, its hollow eyes boring into mine. Then it spoke, its voice a low, guttural growl. "You cannot stop what has begun," it hissed. "The world belongs to us now." The chanting intensified, reverberating not just through the tunnels but seeming to vibrate within my very bones. The flickering light of my torch danced across the slick, moss-covered walls, casting grotesque shadows that writhed and shifted like tortured souls. The air grew thick, heavy with an ancient, cloying sweetness that stung my nostrils and coated my tongue with a metallic tang. I pressed on, the weight of the papal guard's sword a cold comfort in my grip. Ahead, the tunnel widened into a vast cavern, the source of the chanting. My light was swallowed by the darkness, revealing only the faintest outlines of something vast. Slowly, I advanced, my boots splashing through unseen puddles. The chanting grew louder, clearer. It wasn't Latin, or any language I recognized. It was a guttural, rhythmic drone, punctuated by sharp clicking sounds that set my teeth on edge. I raised my torch higher, the light finally catching the edge of a structure. It resembled an altar, colossal in size, carved from a single piece of black, glistening stone. Around it, figures swayed in the flickering torchlight, their robes the color of dried blood. They weren't human. Not entirely. Their bodies were elongated, grotesquely thin, their limbs too long, too jointed. Their heads were small, almost vestigial, perched atop impossibly long necks. Their faces. I can scarcely describe them. Pale, almost translucent skin stretched tight over sharp bone, with eyes that were nothing more than black pits, reflecting the flickering light like pools of stagnant oil. And in the center of the altar, bathed in an unnatural, pulsing light, was the source of the clicking, a pulsating, fleshy mass the size of a small cart. It throbbed rhythmically, its surface covered in a network of veins that pulsed with a sickly green light. From it, tendrils extended, reaching out to the robed figures, caressing them, merging with them. The clicking came from deep within the mass, a wet, organic sound that seemed to echo the rhythm of my own heart. I stood, frozen, my breath caught in my throat. My mission, the Pope, the Vatican, all of it faded into insignificance. This was something beyond comprehension, something ancient and terrifying that defied all logic and reason. One of the robed figures turned, its black eyes fixing on me. The chanting faltered, then ceased. A wave of silence washed over the cavern, so profound it felt like a physical pressure against my eardrums. Then, the figure raised a long, skeletal finger and pointed directly at me. A low growl rumbled through the cavern, emanating not from the figures but from the pulsating mass on the altar. The tendrils writhed and pulsed, reaching out, yearning. I felt a pull, a magnetic force drawing me towards the altar, towards the throbbing heart of the thing. I tried to step back, to flee, but my legs felt leaden, my body unresponsive. The robed figures began to move, gliding towards me, their movements unnervingly smooth, their black eyes burning into me. I raised the papal guard's sword, the cold steel a meager defense against the horror that was unfolding before me. "Get back!" I croaked, my voice a dry rasp, but the figures continued to advance, their robes rustling against the damp stone. The pulsing mass on the altar throbbed faster, the green light intensifying. The clicking grew louder, more frantic. I felt a sharp pain in my head, a searing agony that made me cry out. The figures were closing in, their long, skeletal fingers reaching out, their touch promising something far worse than death. Suddenly, a voice echoed through the cavern, a voice that was both familiar and utterly alien. It spoke in the same guttural tongue as the chanting, yet I understood, somehow, the meaning of its words. "He is the vessel, bring him forth." The figures surged forward, their grip closing around my arms, dragging me towards the altar, towards the pulsating mass, towards the heart of the nightmare. I struggled, fought, but their grip was like iron. The pain in my head intensified, blinding, consuming. I felt myself being lifted, carried towards the altar, towards the waiting tendrils, towards the... My vision blurred. The chanting returned, louder than ever, drowning out all other sounds. The green light pulsed, filling my vision, searing my retinas. I felt the tendrils brush against my skin, cold, slimy, and then... darkness. A swirling vortex of black, consuming me, pulling me down, down, down into an abyss of unimaginable horror. I felt a sense of detachment, of separation, as if my consciousness was being pulled free from my body. And then, a single, terrifying thought pierced the darkness. I was no longer myself. I was the vessel. And the nightmare had only just begun. The chanting swelled, vibrating the very stone beneath my feet. It felt less like human voices, and more like the groaning of the earth itself. A prelude to some terrible cataclysm. I pressed myself further into the shadows of the alcove. The cold biting through my thin black suit. The flickering candlelight painted dancing, grotesque shadows on the walls, twisting familiar shapes into monstrous visages. Below me, in the vast, circular chamber, the cardinals formed a ring of crimson around the central altar. Their faces, normally so composed and dignified, were contorted in a mixture of ecstasy and something darker, something I couldn't quite name. It was a hunger, a yearning, reflected in the glazed, unseeing stare of their eyes. The air grew thick, heavy with the scent of incense and something else, something metallic and coppery, like blood. My stomach churned. The chanting reached a crescendo, and the cardinals began to sway rhythmically, their movements strangely synchronized, almost hypnotic. I risked a glance at the altar. The Pope was there, prostrate before a large obsidian monolith that I hadn't noticed before. It pulsed with a faint, inner light, like a dark heart, beating slowly within the earth. The monolith was covered in intricate carvings, symbols I recognized from the forbidden texts I'd studied, symbols of ancient, forgotten gods, gods of darkness and chaos. Suddenly, the chanting stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, suffocating. The cardinals froze, their heads tilted back, their eyes fixed on the ceiling. A low, guttural growl echoed through the chamber, emanating from the monolith. The obsidian surface began to shimmer, to undulate, like water disturbed by an unseen hand. Then, it split open. Not with a crack or a shatter, but with a slow, sickening unfolding, like the petals of a monstrous obsidian flower. From within the darkness that spilled forth, a shape began to emerge. It was tall and slender, vaguely humanoid, but twisted and contorted in ways that defied nature. Its skin was the color of polished jet, and its limbs were long and spindly, ending in sharp, claw-like fingers. The cardinals prostrated themselves even lower, their bodies trembling. The Pope remained kneeling, his head bowed in supplication. The creature, whatever it was, turned its gaze upon him. It had no discernible features, only a smooth, featureless surface where a face should have been. Yet, I could feel its gaze, cold and piercing, like needles of ice driven into my soul. It raised one of its long, slender arms and extended a finger towards the Pope. A thin, black tendril, like a wisp of smoke, snaked out from the fingertip and touched the Pope's forehead. The Pope's body convulsed, and a low moan escaped his lips. I knew, with a chilling certainty, that I was witnessing something far more horrifying than any assassination I could have carried out. This was not a killing but a possession, a ritual older than the Church itself, a pact made with powers beyond human comprehension. I had to get out of there. My mission was irrelevant now. The fate of the world, perhaps the fate of reality itself, hung in the balance. I began to inch my way back, my heart hammering against my ribs. I moved slowly, carefully, trying not to make a sound. The creature, its attention still fixed on the Pope, seemed oblivious to my presence. I reached the edge of the alcove, my hand brushing against the cold stone of the doorway. Suddenly, a voice, cold and sharp as shattered glass, echoed through the chamber. "Going somewhere?" I froze. The cardinals remained prostrate, unmoving. The creature didn't even turn its head. The voice seemed to come from everywhere, and nowhere at once. Slowly, I turned around. Standing in the shadows of the alcove, just a few feet away, was Cardinal Orsini. His face, normally so bland and unremarkable, was twisted into a grotesque smile, his eyes burning with an unholy light. He took a step towards me. "You've seen too much," he hissed, his voice barely a whisper. He raised his hand, and I saw that he held a long silver dagger, its blade gleaming in the faint candlelight. The dagger was not the ceremonial kind, but a wicked, curved blade, designed for a single, brutal purpose. "The shepherd welcomes new lambs," Orsini whispered, his smile widening, "and the flock must be protected." He lunged. The dagger flashed. I screamed. The scream died in my throat, choked by the darkness that enveloped me. The chanting began again, deeper, more resonant, more terrifying than before. It filled the air, filling my mind, filling the world. And within that chanting, I heard something else, something faint and whispering, something that chilled me to the very core of my being. It was my own voice, joining the chorus. I was the assassin sent to kill the Pope, but I found something worse, and now I was becoming a part of it. I pressed my back against the cold, damp stone, the chill seeping into my bones, mirroring the icy dread in my heart. The chanting continued, resonating through the hidden chambers beneath the Vatican, a perverse lullaby that promised anything but sleep. I could feel the vibrations in my teeth, a rhythmic pulse of something ancient and unholy. The obsidian dagger, blessed by my order for this unholy mission, felt heavy in my hand. Its edge, honed to an impossible sharpness, seemed to hum with a dark energy, reflecting the flickering light of my dwindling lantern. I could almost hear it whispering, urging me forward, promising release from the gnawing fear. I had passed through corridors adorned with frescoes that twisted familiar biblical scenes into grotesque parodies. Cherubs with vacant, soulless eyes leered from the walls, their rosy cheeks stained with something that looked suspiciously like blood. Saints were depicted in postures of agony and despair, their halos cracked and tarnished. The further I descended, the more the art morphed from religious iconography into something primal, something inhuman. The chanting grew louder, punctuated by rhythmic thuds. I crept forward, my footsteps swallowed by the thick carpets that muffled the sounds of my approach. The corridor opened into a vast cavern, its ceiling lost in the shadows thrown by my flickering lantern. In the center, bathed in the unearthly glow of an unseen light source, a group of figures robed in crimson chanted around a pulsating, fleshy mass. It was the source of the rhythmic thudding. Each pulse sent a ripple across the cavern, a wave of palpable dread that washed over me, stealing my breath. The mass quivered, expanding and contracting, its surface covered in a network of veins that pulsed with a sickly green light. My stomach churned. The air was thick with the coppery tang of blood and something else, something ancient and foul, like the breath of a long-dead god. The chanting reached a crescendo, and one of the robed figures stepped forward, raising a ceremonial dagger above the pulsating mass. It wasn't the Pope. None of them were. This was something else entirely, something far more terrifying than any mortal man. The dagger plunged downwards, and the fleshy mass convulsed, emitting a high-pitched shriek that echoed through the cavern, bouncing off the unseen walls. A wave of pure, unadulterated terror washed over me, paralyzing me in place. It was a fear so profound, so primal, that it bypassed thought and went straight to the core of my being. It was the fear of something not meant to be seen, not meant to be understood. The robed figures continued their chanting, their voices rising and falling in a hypnotic rhythm. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything but witness this unholy ritual, but I was frozen, trapped in the grip of an unseen force. The pulsating mass began to change, to morph. Its surface bubbled and writhed, and I saw with a horror that chilled me to the bone that it was forming a face. A grotesque, inhuman face, with eyes that glowed with the same sickly green light as the veins that crisscrossed its surface. The face opened its mouth, and a voice, ancient and resonant, filled the cavern. It spoke in a language I didn't understand, yet every syllable resonated with a power that made my bones ache. It was a language of creation and destruction, of life and death, a language that predated humanity. As the voice spoke, the robed figures prostrated themselves before the pulsating mass, their faces pressed against the cold stone floor. They trembled, their bodies racked with silent sobs. I finally managed to break free from the paralyzing fear that had gripped me. I had to get out, to warn someone, anyone, about what I had seen. But as I turned to flee, I saw something that stopped me dead in my tracks. Standing in the shadows at the far end of the cavern, bathed in the faint glow of the unseen light source, was a figure I recognized. It was the Pope. He wasn't robed in crimson like the others. He wore his papal vestments, his face pale and drawn, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and reverence. He watched the pulsating mass, the grotesque face, with an expression that I couldn't quite comprehend. It wasn't the look of a prisoner, but of a disciple. My mission, my purpose, everything I had believed in crumbled around me. The Pope wasn't the target. He was part of it. He was complicit in this abomination. The chanting continued. The rhythmic thudding resonated through the cavern, and the grotesque face continued its pronouncements in the ancient tongue. I stood there, frozen, caught between the desire to flee and the horrifying fascination of what I was witnessing. I had come to the Vatican to assassinate the Pope. But I had found something far worse. I had found something that threatened not just the Church, not just humanity, but the very fabric of reality itself. And the Pope, the supposed leader of the faithful, was kneeling before it in worship. What had I stumbled into? What was this monstrous entity? And what was the Pope's role in this unholy ritual? These questions echoed in my mind, drowning out the chanting, the thudding, and the ancient voice. I knew I had to escape, to find answers, to warn the world. But a chilling premonition settled over me, a certainty that I was already too late. The world, as I knew it, was already gone. The chanting swelled, vibrating through the very floor beneath my feet. I clung to the edge of the shadowed alcove, my muscles screaming in protest. The incense, once cloying and sweet, now tasted of acrid bile on the back of my throat. The cardinals, their faces rapturous and terrifying in the flickering candlelight, formed a tight circle around the altar. On it, bathed in an unnatural glow, rested the obsidian dagger. I knew I had to get it. It was the key, the only way to end this nightmare. But something held me back. A primal fear, cold and viscous, coiled in my gut. The chanting grew louder, punctuated by the rhythmic thumping that I now recognized as coming from beneath the altar. A slow, heavy beat, like a gargantuan heart struggling to maintain its rhythm. Each pulse seemed to draw me closer, a morbid fascination overriding my terror. I edged further out of the alcove, my boots scraping against the ancient stone. The cardinals seemed oblivious to my presence, lost in their fervent ritual. I was a ghost, a shadow flitting through the edges of their reality. The thumping intensified. The altar began to vibrate, the candles flickering wildly, casting grotesque shadows that danced across the frescoed walls. The chanting reached a fever pitch, and the cardinals raised their hands, their fingers splayed in an unholy gesture. And then, silence. A silence so profound, so absolute, that it pressed against my eardrums, a physical force that threatened to crush me. I held my breath, every muscle taut, every sense on high alert. The obsidian dagger pulsed with a faint inner light, its surface shimmering. The altar cracked. A single, jagged fissure snaked across its surface, spreading outwards like a spider web. The cardinals remained motionless, their eyes fixed on the growing crack, their faces masks of ecstatic horror. The thumping resumed, louder now, more insistent, accompanied by a low, guttural growl that seemed to emanate from the very bowels of the earth. The crack widened, revealing a gaping chasm beneath the altar, a swirling vortex of darkness filled with whispers and shadows pulsed within. The air grew thick with the stench of decay, a miasma of ancient evil that choked the breath from my lungs. From the darkness, a hand emerged. Not a human hand. This was something else. Skeletal and elongated, its skin stretched taut across bone, the flesh a sickly, translucent gray. Claws, long and sharp as razors, tipped each finger. The hand gripped the edge of the cracked altar, pulling itself upwards, revealing a second hand. Then a third, and finally, a fourth. A creature began to haul itself out of the abyss. Its body was a grotesque parody of human anatomy. Twisted and elongated, its limbs impossibly long, its torso grotesquely thin. Its head was small and pointed, with eyes that glowed with a malevolent intelligence, a cold, calculating gaze that seemed to pierce through the very fabric of my soul. Its skin, the same sickly gray as its hands, clung to its bones, revealing the intricate structure beneath. Its mouth, a gaping maw filled with needle-sharp teeth, opened in a silent scream. The cardinals prostrated themselves before the creature, their faces pressed against the cold stone floor. The creature, its emergence complete, stood over them, its shadow stretching across the altar, engulfing the obsidian dagger. It turned its gaze towards me. Time seemed to slow to a crawl. The creature's eyes, burning with an ancient, unyielding malice, locked onto mine. I was paralyzed, frozen in place by the sheer weight of its gaze. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that this creature was not merely an aberration, a monster. It was something older, something primordial. It was the source of the whispers, the heart of the darkness that had infected the Vatican. It reached out a hand, its long, skeletal fingers beckoning me closer. A voice, raspy and ancient, echoed in my mind, not through my ears but directly into my thoughts. Join us. The voice was a seductive whisper, a promise of power, of knowledge, of an eternity spent basking in the darkness. I felt myself swaying, drawn towards the creature, towards the abyss. The obsidian dagger, now within its reach, seemed to pulse in time with the creature's heartbeat. I had to resist, I had to fight, but how could I fight something so ancient, so powerful, something that existed beyond the realm of human comprehension? My mind reeled, struggling against the creature's influence. I closed my eyes, trying to block out its gaze, its voice, its very presence. I focused on a single thought, a single image, the face of my daughter, her bright smile, the warmth of her hand in mine. Join us. The voice echoed again, stronger this time, more insistent. The creature took a step towards me, its shadow stretching further, engulfing me in its darkness. I opened my eyes, and for a fleeting moment I saw a flicker of something in the creature's gaze. Not malice, not hatred, but recognition. "We know you," the voice whispered, its tone laced with a chilling familiarity. "We have been waiting for you." And then the world went black. The chanting continued, a low, guttural thrumming that vibrated through the very stone beneath my feet. The air, thick with the smell of incense and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, pressed down on me. My hand, still gripping the hilt of my silenced pistol, was slick with sweat. I had to move, had to find a way out of this subterranean labyrinth beneath the Vatican, a place that felt less like a holy sanctuary and more like the belly of some monstrous slumbering beast. Following the crimson trail, now more a viscous ooze than distinct droplets, I pressed deeper into the tunnels. The chanting grew louder, interspersed with rhythmic, almost mechanical clicks and whirs. The architecture shifted. The rough-hewn stone of the older tunnels gave way to smooth, polished obsidian walls, pulsating with an internal light that seemed to shift and breathe. Strange symbols, unlike any religious iconography I'd ever seen, were etched into the surface, glowing with the same unsettling luminescence. They looked disturbingly biological, like veins and arteries mapped onto a dark, pulsating heart. Ahead, the tunnel opened into a vast cavern. I peered around the corner, my breath catching in my throat. The cavern was dominated by a colossal, cylindrical structure made of the same black obsidian. It was covered in those pulsating organic symbols and hummed with the source of the mechanical whirring I had heard earlier. Cables and tubes filled with a luminescent fluid the same color as the symbols snaked across the floor and connected to the cylinder at various points. The chanting reached a fever pitch. Around the base of the cylinder, robed figures, their faces obscured by deep cowls, prostrated themselves. They weren't chanting in Latin, or any language I recognized. The sounds were guttural, primal, emanating from deep within their chests, almost like the growling of animals. In the center of the circle, bathed in the unsettling glow of the obsidian cylinder, stood the Pope, but he was different. The gentle, frail man I'd seen earlier was gone. He was taller, his posture ramrod straight, his eyes burning with an unnatural light. He held a gleaming obsidian dagger, its blade dripping with the same crimson fluid that had led me here. I watched, frozen in place, as the Pope raised the dagger above his head. The chanting ceased. A silence so profound it felt like a physical pressure descended upon the cavern. Then, the Pope brought the dagger down, not in a stabbing motion, but in a slow, deliberate arc, as if slicing through something invisible. A low groan echoed through the cavern, followed by a series of clicks and whirs from the obsidian cylinder. The luminescent fluid within the tubes pulsed faster, brighter. The organic symbols on the surface of the cylinder seemed to writhe and shift. And then, a section of the cylinder's surface slid open, revealing. It wasn't anything I could comprehend. It was a pulsating mass of flesh, bone, and metal, intertwined in a grotesque parody of organic life. Tentacles, tipped with razor-sharp blades, writhed and pulsed. Multiple eyes, unblinking and cold, stared out from the fleshy mass. The metallic, sweet smell intensified, now almost overpowering. The robed figures began chanting again, this time in a higher, more frenzied pitch. The Pope, his face contorted in an expression of ecstatic agony, extended his hand towards the pulsating mass. One of the tentacles reached out, delicately wrapping itself around his wrist. I understood then. The Pope wasn't being controlled. He was willingly offering himself, merging with this thing. This abomination. This was the true power behind the Vatican, the horror hidden beneath layers of piety and tradition. My hand tightened on the grip of my pistol. I had been sent to assassinate the Pope. But the man before me, the creature he was becoming, was beyond assassination. This wasn't a matter of political power or religious dogma anymore. This was a fight for the very soul of humanity. I took a deep breath, the metallic stench filling my lungs. This was suicide, I knew, but some things are worth dying for. I stepped out of the shadows, the silenced pistol raised. The chanting faltered. The robed figures turned, their faces still hidden by their cowls. But I could feel their gaze, cold and malevolent, upon me. The Pope, or what was left of him, turned his burning eyes towards me. A slow, chilling smile spread across his face. "You have seen too much," he whispered, his voice a distorted echo of its former self. "But you will join us. You will become one with the glory." The tentacles of the pulsating mass began to extend towards me, reaching, grasping, hungry. I squeezed the trigger. The shot echoed through the cavern, a small, sharp sound swallowed by the vastness of the space, but it was enough. The robed figure surged forward, a wave of black cloth and fury. I fired again, and again, emptying the magazine into the oncoming horde. The bullets ripped through their robes, but they kept coming, relentless, driven by something beyond human comprehension. I knew I wouldn't survive, but I had to buy time. I had to warn someone, somehow, about the horror that lurked beneath the Vatican. The horror that was about to be unleashed upon the world. As the robed figures descended upon me, I fumbled for another magazine, my fingers slick with sweat and blood. The last thing I saw, before the darkness consumed me, was the pulsating mass, its multiple eyes fixed on me, and the chilling smile on the Pope's face, widening into a triumphant grin. I was the assassin sent to kill the Pope, but I found something worse. Part 21 of 25. The chanting intensified. It vibrated through the stone floor, through my bones, a physical manifestation of the unnatural energy swirling in the chamber. Cardinal Orsini's face, bathed in the pulsating crimson light from the orb, was a mask of ecstatic terror. He swayed, arms outstretched as if embracing the entity within the glass. The other cardinals, their faces similarly transfixed, mimicked his movements, a grotesque ballet of religious fervor and dawning madness. I glanced at Sister Agnes. Her expression was the most disturbing of all, a serene, almost blissful acceptance. The fight had left her eyes. She no longer seemed concerned with escape, consumed instead by whatever dark promise the entity was whispering to her soul. It speaks, she whispered, her voice hollow. It promises peace, an end to suffering. Peace built on the bones of the world, I growled, my voice tight with dread. The orb pulsed again, and a wave of nausea washed over me. The air crackled with an almost palpable darkness. Orsini turned, his eyes burning with a fevered light. The shepherd will guide us. He will cleanse the world of its imperfections. He will bring about the true paradise. Shepherd? I scoffed. This is not God. This is an abomination. He smiled, a chilling, vacant smile. You misunderstand. God is evolving. This is his next form, pure, unburdened by flesh and the weakness of humanity. The orb pulsed once more, and a low, guttural sound echoed from within it, resonating with the chanting. The sound wriggled into my mind, a parasitic worm burrowing into my consciousness. I felt my resolve falter, a seed of doubt planted in the fertile ground of my fear. I shook my head violently, trying to dislodge the insidious whisper. I had to find a way to stop this. To shatter the orb, to break the entity's hold on these men and women, before it spread beyond the Vatican walls. I thought of Father Enrico's notes, of the ancient rituals, the wards, the symbols of binding. There had to be something, some way to counter this power. But my mind was clouded, my thoughts sluggish and disjointed. Suddenly, Sister Agnes lunged at me, a glint of fanaticism in her eyes. I barely parried her attack, the silver crucifix she wielded slicing the air inches from my face. He calls for you, she shrieked. Join us. Embrace the shepherd. I stumbled back, narrowly avoiding a second blow. This wasn't the gentle, compassionate nun I had met in the library. This was a zealot, a puppet dancing to the tune of a cosmic horror. Agnes, snap out of it! I yelled, desperation edging my voice. But my words were lost in the escalating chant, swallowed by the encroaching darkness. The other cardinals were closing in, their faces contorted in religious ecstasy. They were no longer men of God, but mindless drones, ready to sacrifice everything, including their lives, to this alien entity. I fought back, relying on instinct and years of training, but they were relentless, driven by a supernatural fervor. Each blow I landed felt hollow, inconsequential against their unwavering devotion. I was outnumbered, outmatched, and slowly succumbing to the oppressive atmosphere. The orb pulsed again, brighter than before. The guttural sound intensified, now a symphony of discordant whispers that scraped against my sanity. I could feel it pulling at me, beckoning me to join the throng of worshippers, to surrender to the shepherd's embrace. My vision blurred. The chanting became a roar. I staggered, my legs weak. The world around me seemed to distort, the stone walls melting into grotesque, organic shapes. Then, a single, clear thought pierced through the fog of my despair. The vial of holy water Father Enrico had given me. I fumbled for it in my pocket, my fingers numb and clumsy. I pulled it out, the glass cold against my skin. It was my last hope, a fragile defense against the encroaching darkness. With a surge of adrenaline, I lunged towards the orb, dodging the grasping hands of the cardinals. I raised the vial, my hand trembling. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, I whispered, my voice choked with fear and determination. The orb pulsed one final time, a blinding flash of crimson light. Then, everything went black. I was the assassin sent to kill the Pope, but I found something worse. Part 22. The chanting intensified. The vibrations emanating from the obsidian altar seemed to resonate with my own bones, a sickening hum that burrowed deeper with each passing moment. I gripped the spear of destiny, its cold metal, a stark contrast to the burning fear that threatened to consume me. The air crackled with an unseen energy, a tangible weight that pressed down, suffocating. Cardinal Rossi stood before the altar, his face bathed in an unholy crimson glow emanating from the swirling vortex above. He was no longer the man I knew, the man I had respected, even feared. His eyes, once sharp and intelligent, were now vacant, glazed over with an otherworldly light. He smiled, a chilling, predatory expression that stretched his lips thin and revealed too much gum. "The vessel is prepared," he rasped, his voice hollow and echoing, as if spoken from the depths of a cavern. "The time of ascension is at hand." He gestured towards the altar. Strapped to the cold, black stone, her limbs splayed, as if in macabre crucifixion, was Sister Magdalena. Her eyes were wide, fixed on the swirling vortex, her lips moving silently in prayer. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, glistening in the unnatural light. My stomach churned. I had to stop this. I had to save her. But my limbs felt heavy, as if mired in thick mud. The chanting continued, a hypnotic drone that seemed to paralyze my will. "With this sacrifice," Rossi continued, his voice rising in a crescendo, "the gates will open. He will return, and we will be rewarded beyond measure." He raised a ceremonial dagger, its blade glinting in the crimson light. The chanting reached a fever pitch, the vibrations shaking the very foundations of the chapel. I had to act, now. I lunged forward, the spear of destiny held aloft, but as I moved, the air around me solidified, an invisible barrier holding me back. I pushed, strained, but the force was insurmountable. I was trapped, a helpless spectator to the unfolding horror. Rossi brought the dagger down. A blinding flash of light erupted from the altar, momentarily silencing the chanting. When my vision cleared, Sister Magdalena was gone. The altar was empty, save for a small, pulsating orb of crimson energy. It throbbed like a heart, radiating an intense heat. Rossi reached out a trembling hand and touched the orb. He gasped, his body convulsing. The crimson light intensified, engulfing him completely. The chanting resumed, louder, more frenzied than before. The air around Rossi began to distort, shimmering like heat haze. His form seemed to stretch, to grow, to become something else. Horns, black and twisted, sprouted from his forehead. His skin turned a sickly shade of green, and his eyes glowed with a malevolent fire. His robes ripped and tore, revealing leathery wings that unfurled with a sickening crack. The being that stood before me was no longer human. It was a grotesque mockery of life, a creature of pure, unadulterated evil. It spoke, its voice a guttural roar that echoed through the chapel, shaking the very stones. At last, it boomed, the words laced with ancient power. "I am free." The cardinals, who had, until now, been chanting in unison, fell prostrate before the creature, their faces contorted in adoration. The creature's gaze fell upon me. The invisible barrier that had held me captive dissipated, and I felt a wave of pure terror wash over me. I knew, with chilling certainty, that I was facing something far beyond my comprehension, something that dwarfed even the horrors I had witnessed in the Vatican archives. "You," it hissed, its voice dripping with venom. "You carry the instrument of my demise. You dare stand before me?" I gripped the spear of destiny tighter, the cold metal, a small comfort in the face of unimaginable dread. I knew I couldn't defeat this creature, not with force. But I had to try, for Sister Magdalena, for the world. "I will not let you win," I managed, my voice trembling. The creature laughed, a sound that chilled me to the bone. "Foolish mortal," it sneered. "You cannot comprehend the power I wield. I am the beginning, the end. I am." "So," it paused, its gaze sweeping across the chapel, settling on the terrified faces of the prostrate cardinals. A cruel smile spread across its face. "I am the one who waits behind the door." The chanting intensified, becoming a deafening roar. The creature raised its hand, and a bolt of crimson energy shot towards me. I braced myself for the impact. The spear of destiny held before me like a shield, but the bolt didn't strike me. It struck the door behind me, the heavy oak splintering and exploding inwards. And beyond the door, I saw it. The true horror. The thing that had waited, patiently, for millennia. The thing that the Vatican had so desperately tried to conceal. The chanting stopped. Even the creature seemed to recoil in awe, in fear. It was a vast, amorphous shape, a swirling mass of darkness that seemed to consume the light itself. It stretched beyond the confines of the doorway, beyond the limits of my comprehension. It was a void, an emptiness, a nothingness that threatened to swallow everything whole. And from that void, a single, colossal eye opened, fixing its gaze upon me. I stumbled back, the chanting growing louder, vibrating the very stone beneath my feet. The light emanating from the thing on the altar pulsed in time with the rhythm, bathing the chamber in an unholy strobe effect. My hand flew to the crucifix tucked beneath my shirt, clutching it as if it were a lifeline in a stormy sea. It felt cold, inert, offering no comfort. Even the faint, familiar scent of sandalwood seemed to have been leached away, replaced by the metallic tang of blood and something else. Something sickeningly sweet, like overripe fruit. Cardinal Rossi, his face now a mask of ecstatic fervor, extended a hand towards me. "Join us, brother," he crooned, his voice echoing strangely in the cavernous space. "Embrace the truth. Become one with the glorified one." The glorified one. The name itself felt like a blasphemy, a violation of something sacred. I shook my head, my stomach churning. The chanting intensified, pressing in on me, suffocating me. The other robed figures, their faces now clearly visible in the pulsating light, were a grotesque parody of religious devotion. Their eyes, wide and unblinking, reflected the crimson glow of the altar. Their mouths moved in unison, forming the words of the chant, but their voices were wrong. They were hollow, distorted, as if emanating from something other than human throats. I glanced back at the tunnel, my only escape route. But the entrance was now blocked by two figures, the Swiss guards I had incapacitated earlier. They stood motionless, their halberds held stiffly at their sides, their eyes fixed on the altar with the same unsettling devotion as the others. Their uniforms were stained with the same viscous, dark fluid that coated the altar. Trapped. I was trapped in this subterranean nightmare with these things. My mind reeled, desperately trying to make sense of what I was seeing. What was that on the altar? It pulsed and throbbed, a mass of flesh and something else. Something metallic and alien. Tendrils of darkness snaked outwards, caressing the robed figures, who leaned into the touch with sighs of ecstasy. My gaze was drawn back to Rossi. He was still holding his hand out towards me, a smile playing on his lips. "Resist no longer," he urged, his voice now taking on a guttural quality. "The glorified one calls to you. He offers power beyond your wildest dreams." Power. The word echoed in my mind, a dark temptation whispering in the shadows. I had sought power all my life, the power to shape my own destiny, the power to avenge my family. But this was not power, this was an abomination. "No," I choked out, the word barely audible above the chanting. "I will not." Rossi's smile vanished, replaced by a look of cold fury. He lowered his hand, his voice hardening. "Then you will be cleansed, you will be made scroll-worthy." He gestured to the Swiss guards, who moved with a disconcerting speed, their halberds raised. I knew I couldn't fight them both, not in this confined space, not in my weakened state. But I wouldn't go down without a fight. I drew my own blade, the steel cold against my palm. It felt different down here, lighter somehow, almost vibrating. As the guards advanced, I saw something move in the shadows at the edge of the chamber, a flicker of movement, almost too quick to register, a glint of metal, then a scream. One of the Swiss guards staggered back, clutching his throat, a dark stain blossoming on his white uniform. He collapsed to the ground, his halberd clattering on the stone floor. Another flicker of movement, another scream. The second guard fell, his body twitching. The chanting faltered, the robed figures turning towards the source of the disturbance, their faces contorted in confusion and fear.